Thanks, Russ. And now I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker today. And as Lynn mentioned earlier, one thing I know for sure is that we are certainly looking forward to Gail speaking today. I would refer you back to the agenda. There are some comments about her background and what she does, and then her slides are also back there for your reference. But as excited as we are to have Gail here today, I know that she is equally excited and was extremely determined to get here. She spoke yesterday in Oklahoma City, and due to the recent weather and airline difficulties, actually had quite an adventure. I think that's a nice way of putting it. In getting here from Boston on Tuesday, which included a few rental cars, a few mechanical delays, quite a bit of time to think, I'm sure. But personally, I do feel like that does speak volumes about Gail the person, because it would have been easy to say, the weather's not cooperating, I don't think I can make it. Instead, she got into a rental car and drove about 3 hours to Hartford, Connecticut to catch a flight to Dallas, only to wait for a plane to be ready to send her to Oklahoma City. And then eventually made it here, where we enjoyed a nice dinner getting to know Gail last night, coincidentally at a restaurant named Lucky's. We're fortunate to have you here. She writes an ethics column for Entrepreneur Magazine, the ethics coach. She is a business executive coach. She has her own blog. She does a lot of wonderful things and has a lot to say about this topic. I would reiterate what Lynn said earlier. She is extremely interested in hearing from us at the end of her presentation, what kinds of questions do we have. Fortunately, you won't have to wait the 3 to 4 to 6 months that the people that ask her questions do for Entrepreneur Magazine. You should get an answer today, and you might see it in her column down the road. With that, I would say, please help me in welcoming Gail O'Brien to the stage today to talk about, I'm at a loss now for the title, The Leadership Edge. Sorry about that. Thank you, Gail.
Good afternoon. It's a delight to be here. Thank you, Lynn, for inviting me and for giving me the topic, Leadership Edge. There's so much more that we can do to anchor leadership and culture and values into our organizations. Given the unpredictable, changing world that we're in, it puts increasing pressure on leaders and on organizations. And so there's so much more we can do to strengthen leadership. And so the topic today, Leadership Edge, there's so many things we could be discussing. But I have something I'd really like you to think about. And I will feel successful if what happens is you think about the subject of spiritual intelligence. It's a complicated subject. It fuels leadership, which is why I felt it was so important to talk about it. And I just want to plant some seeds that may invite you at the end of the presentation on your table. You'll see that there's a couple of pages of resources. I think it's a really important topic. So I appreciate the opportunity to raise it with you. I, as Michael said, work in and write about leadership with a hard-won expertise in crisis and how to avoid it. My purpose in 30 years of working, nearly 30 years, of working with leaders whose organizations are in change, challenge, or crisis is how we can avoid, how we can first see the kinds of red flags and signs that lead to ethical challenges, and then how we can address them and avoid them derailing our organization. the topic spiritual intelligence isn't necessarily a familiar one. Some people may think it's connected to religion. It's not. You can be very religious or agnostic, and it has no bearing on whether you have high or low developed spiritual intelligence. Some people think that it's just too Californian sounding, that it's much more appropriate for a yoga studio discussion than for a conference room or a boardroom. And some others might think that it just sounds weird. But you don't have to levitate, and you don't have to become a vegetarian. And based on the delicious-looking dinner, that's a good thing. My reason for coming to the topic of spiritual intelligence and how it impacts leadership is that for years I have been searching for a way that ethics and ethical behavior in organizations can become more a part of culture. And I, like perhaps some of you, have looked at the concept of ethical leadership, authentic leadership, common purpose leadership, servant leadership, conscious leadership. And they're all each wonderful in terms of what they bring to a leader if that's how a leader sees operating. But the reality is they haven't been widely adopted. They haven't really had an impact. And so my hope and purpose is to suggest to you something that isn't a brand of leadership, it isn't a type of leadership, it is what we draw from in leadership. It fuels our leadership. So that's my starting place. What I'd like to do is give you 3 ideas. I have a definition I'm going to share with you, and you'll see why I needed a definition once you see the larger explanation of spiritual intelligence. But I have a definition that we'll go into in a minute, but it's going to be based around supporting 3 basic themes. The first is spiritual intelligence is that which enables what's within a leader to show up just when it's needed most. The second theme is the narrower the lens, the greater the likelihood or potential for something called self-seal. Is that a term anybody's familiar with? Oh, good. Well, I hope that you like it when we get to describing it. To me, when I discovered it about 6 or 7 years ago, I thought, this is so perfect. It explains so many ethical lapses, and we're not conscious of it. So we'll get to that. The third theme is that values take hold in culture when there's a wholehearted process of moving to we. So let's begin with an incredibly artful, very important design element that shows my great expertise. For most of us in this room, I think, when we think of intelligence, we think of IQ, because we grew up with IQ seeming to embrace everything. Then about 20 years ago, a psychologist named Daniel Goleman published an article in the Harvard Business Review, What Makes a Leader? And in that, he introduced emotional intelligence. Not that he's the first, but we tend to associate it with him. And emotional intelligence includes self-awareness, self-mastery, empathy, motivation, and social skills. 2 years after his article was published, the researchers who have been working for a long time made public in greater visibility their work on spiritual intelligence. Now, in this astonishingly talented graph, which means that I do have a second career in design, I know, I'm trying to create, there's a tremendous complexity about spiritual intelligence, which is why it isn't on our radar. The definitions include all these wonderful things: how we access beauty, awe, deep meaning, higher purpose, how we get at moral intelligence, exercise compassion, and on and on and on. And they're all wonderful. And I can't imagine what it would be like to be a human being without spiritual intelligence, because I wouldn't be able to imagine without spiritual intelligence in the first place. The challenge in looking at this is that while it does integrate IQ and emotional intelligence, and it brings it into the whole, and part of what it does is give us the whole of it, that isn't the type of description that any leader is necessarily going to look at with any energy and figure out how it applies in his or her daily work. So my challenge was to come up with what I felt in integrity was a definition that did justice. And keep in mind, I'm not a scientist, so I'm not going to try to talk about the science behind brainwaves and what makes spiritual intelligence in the same way that EQ and IQ operate. I want us to focus, if we could please, on opening ourselves to the possibility that there's something about spiritual intelligence that we can use to make better decisions, that we can use to be better leaders. And with that build-up, this is the definition. Spiritual intelligence is the ability to access deeper meaning and to integrate multiple ways of knowing, to see and solve or resolve the right problems. Now, what I mean by multiple ways of knowing, we get information from so many sources, from data, from facts, from discussions, from feedback, from our own emotions giving us information, from our body giving us signals, from intuition. And so there are so many ways of knowing that help balance and check, that are really important to be able to be open to the gamut of emotion, of things within how we know information. And it's based on a number of attributes that I think are essential for effective leadership. The first is being fully present, operating out of values and purpose, asking the question behind the question. So often we answer what is asked, but we aren't always asked what is really on somebody's mind. We don't really get to the heart of something unless we're really listening and we understand that what they're asking is the tip of the iceberg. And in some cases, it's a great way to explore, and you can find out red flags about a number of things because people aren't always as direct as we would like them to be. We're not always as direct as we would like to be. And then inviting diverse and conflicting views. The idea of seeing the whole of it has to do with, in some ways, protecting ourselves by ensuring that we're seeing multiple perspectives. And often we seek out like-minded people to solve problems with. It's more comfortable, it's more congenial, and we arrive, it's even harder with like-minded people to arrive at a plan of action. But the ability to understand at the beginning that we want to pull in people who probably don't agree with us, the idea of that would be that the ability to see the many perspectives in the beginning is going to help us see what the problem really needs, and it saves us more time by being able to do that. The idea of left and right brain, how many people have used the term or know what whole-brained thinking is? Some of you do, and we're going to talk a little bit about it. There's something like 53 million hits on Google for whole-brain thinking. It's taking our left brain approach and our right brain approach and integrating it, which allows us, again, to see the whole of it. And that's sort of the message, the ability to expand to see the whole. And the best thing about what spiritual intelligence does, it's based on moving from I to we, out of the self-interest, out of our own frame of reference, and being able to solve problems by seeing all the people that are impacted and dealing with the we of it. We're going to have an opportunity in 2 table discussions to sort of bring this home rather than having it sound kind of theoretical now, but I just wanted to lay it out for you. This chart kind of reinforces what we just talked about. Mindfulness, which we'll talk a little more about, and then integrity, which are the values that we operate out of, Meaning, knowing, and diversity encapsulate some of the other attributes, which is sort of how we get information to make decisions, the whole-brained approach, and the moving I to we. So there's kind of a flow. Being present is really about being mindful. I'd like to talk about mindfulness for a minute. How many of you on airplanes remember the stewardess saying, in case the cabin pressure changes, put your oxygen mask on first? Do you remember that? I thought that was ridiculous. I mean, if you're traveling with an elderly person or a child, why wouldn't you help the person who is less likely to be able to do it? But it's a very important, and I asked a stewardess that. Okay, it was a dumb question, but I asked. And the response is, you won't be good to anybody if you haven't taken care of yourself first. Leaders forget that, and it's a critically important thing. So putting your own mask on first is kind of a clue to be stepping back and starting to ensure that you're protecting what you need to protect in yourself in order to be really effective. Jon Kabat-Zinn, who's done a lot on mindfulness over the last 30 or so years, has an interesting definition. He calls it presence of heart. For companies, however, it's a much more basic kind of thing. Did you know that 25% of US companies have some kind of stress reduction or mindfulness meditation, yoga on site for their employees? A recognition that this is really affecting productivity, it's affecting how people do their work. Aetna came to it because their CEO had a horrible skiing accident and was in such pain that he couldn't function in his job. And so he began to explore alternatives, holistic approaches. And now Aetna has all kinds of mindfulness and meditation classes, and they're even looking at whether they should continue to exempt certain things that in their insurance policies that support people doing this. Google has had over 1,000 employees as of 6 months ago go through various meditation things. But what I think is particularly interesting, and McKinsey has been involved in this for a long time as well, General Mills did a study. 85% of their senior executives who've gone through meditation training said that it increased their listening skills and their overall effectiveness. So it's something powerful to think about. And even if you're remotely like me and sign up for yoga classes and manage to make 2 out of every 12, not a great record. And it's on my list as it's a new year to do a much better job with that. There's lots of other things that we can do to pause and to reflect and to take moments where we're able to be more effective by virtue of how we're operating. Have any of you done mind mapping? Some of you have. Well, if anyone had told me about whole-brain thinking and that it was valuable before I took a whole-brained speed reading class, I would have said that whole-brained does sound very Californian, and that was before I lived actually in California for a while. But I took this class, and my reading when I went in was about 350 words per minute. And as a result of the class, which taught us about mind mapping, which is how you take a complex subject that would be pages and pages of doing a summary or an analysis. You can integrate 8 different topics or more. This example you have is about the uses of mind mapping. And they have 8 uses, which are the spirals out of the center, and then they have all of the different details related to those uses, and then the sub-details. And it's a marvelous way, in the whole of it, to see complex subjects. So I was exposed to that in this whole brain reading. But as a result of eye exercises that they gave us, that we're used to reading from left to right, but they taught us to read the space above the line and below the line, and to read upside down, and to take our finger and go in an S-curve down a page and start retaining what is in the center. And then there were eye exercises that put letters on the page farther and farther away with each exercise so that your eye was taking in the whole of it at once. The end result of all of this, and they did play Baroque music in the background because Baroque music brings out our alpha waves, which helps us concentrate and retain more information. I have to tell you, it worked. I ended up, by the end of that class, reading 3,300 words per minute, which was huge with retention. Now, of course, you have to keep practicing, so I think my reading rate has slipped somewhat. But what it taught me was that this whole-brained approach of expanding our consciousness and what we see is so incredibly valid. And so you'll find some things in your handout. It's definitely, the whole brain approach is a great way to solve problems by looking beyond what you just can see easily. Spiritual intelligence is really about creating equilibrium. It's really about how things come together in such a way that what you need emanates out of you effortlessly. And it's something that, of course, is the opposite of stress. Which brings us to our first idea. Spiritual intelligence enables that which is within a leader to show up when most needed. I'd like to take you on a little journey for a moment. It was 20 years ago, and I was on top of a mountain, Beaver Creek, Colorado. By any stretch of the imagination, I am barely a mediocre skier. I learned to ski in Massachusetts and New England, where ice was really what you skied on, and so it was very fear-based. If you got to the bottom of a mountain and you weren't dead, it was a successful run. So there was something about being on top of Beaver Creek, the first run of the day. No trails had been made, and I picked an intermediate trail, being ambitious that day, and there had been 6 inches of powder snow that had fallen overnight. So I stood at the top of the mountain, drinking in the amazing beauty of feeling all alone on this mountain. It was incredible. And my feet started to move way before my mind was ready for this to begin. And I found that I began to go down the mountain like a real adult. I was actually going in this wonderful rhythm of S-curves as opposed to my normal standard of traversing way across the mountain. But I kept picking up speed, and I kept going faster. And yet it felt completely appropriate that my body and the mountain and my mind were together. And everything I needed, everything I remembered, I went into the right stance. I remembered what I needed to do. I got to the bottom of the mountain, and I realized everything I had needed just came out of me. And I realized that I was seeing the whole of it. I was feeling a very small part of the world because of what it's like on top of a mountain. But it was as if the world and I were completely one. I'm sure you have all had experiences that are similar. For me, I noticed that I started it by pausing. And that was accidental, but it made all the difference. I noticed, I was present, I saw, I took in everything. I was relaxed, which is relatively unique. There was an openness and a clarity and a purposefulness. And I was accessing multiple ways of knowing, as we just talked about before. There's so many ways that we know things that we don't know that we know them until they come out. And I saw the whole of it. So I'd like you to do a table topic exercise, and I'd like you to spend about 8 minutes, and I'd like you to talk to either the person on your right or your left. It's too hard if you talk to a couple of people at once, because what I hope you'll do in lining up in twos is to really have a chance to go through these questions, which I hope you can all read, and talk through them, because you've had an equilibrium moment, and it taught you something. It teaches us all, and what I'd like you to do is to think about, don't have to tell your equilibrium story to your partner because there wasn't time, but I'd like you to acknowledge whether or not what it felt like in that experience, if what you needed actually came out. And then what multiple ways of knowing, because you probably haven't thought about that before, can you think of that helped all that knowledge come together? And then using that in questions 3 and 4, not about the equilibrium experience, but when you make hard decisions, can you share with your partner what ways you rely on most in terms of how you get information to make decisions? And then what would increase your ease in seeing the whole of it? Does that make sense? Thank you for taking that exercise on. Obviously, you talked about equilibrium. The opposite of that is stress. Picking up on red flags avoid ethical breakdowns, but when we're in stress, when we're on overload, that's really hard to do. Multiple ways of knowing and accessing deeper meaning, our values and what we stand for, are all part of having the red flags be more visible to us. If any of you have read the book Blind Spots, why we fail to do what's right and what to do about it, the authors point out what we already know, but it's important to hear it again, that decision-making is most ethically compromised when we're overloaded. So we go back to being in the present, we go back to mindfulness as being incredibly critical. While we're dealing with challenges, I'd like to share a story about how a crisis transformed a leader and brought out his spiritual intelligence. I was recruited to Mitsubishi Motor Manufacturing after a sexual harassment lawsuit when the company needed to create a model workplace. But at the same time that the government was suing Mitsubishi, the Rainbow Push Coalition and Reverend Jackson and the National Organization of Women were leading a national boycott against the company. And the boycott went on for about a year, and finally we were making enough progress that they called the boycott off. But they called it off without a whole lot of faith that we were really going to deliver what we said. So my boss was invited to be the person who spoke at the press conference in New York. His responsibilities, among many other things, were head of financial. And in the speech, an apology was written into his remarks regarding the women who may have been harmed. And when the lawyers saw the apology, they indicated it would compromise the pending litigation, it would cost a great deal of money, it would be the worst possible thing to do, it would weaken the company, and it had to come out. Discussion ended when my boss agreed. It came out. So we went to New York, and the morning of the press conference, when he gave his speech, he put the apology back in. And the energy in the room changed immediately. And later, when a reporter asked a really hostile question of my boss, it was Reverend Jackson who stood up and walked over to the microphone and said, "You need to give this company a chance. Let them do what they said they'd do." I thought a lot about how that change happened. And I realized that he stepped out of the lens of the lawsuit and into his own humanity and values. He did what he felt was right, listening to his own voice. And that's really what changed everything in the culture of the company. Because then we were able to go back and the healing started to begin. The lawsuit was still dealing with what it needed to before it settled. But we were able to begin a major culture change where employees finally could just get back to doing what they needed to do, build cars. And we could have the new values and the new things take hold. So the reality is that if we let it, what we need most will come to the foreground in a situation if we step into our values. The opposite of that is narrowing the lens, and the greater the vulnerability to self-seal. There's a wonderful book that Margaret Wheatley has written called Finding Our Way, Leadership for an Uncertain Time. And I'm going to read this because I want you to get the sense of it, but I hope you're reading along too. "I know that we notice what we notice," she writes, "because of who we are. We create ourselves by what we choose to notice. Once this work of self-authorship is begun, we inhabit the world we've created, we self-seal. We don't notice anything except those things that confirm what we already think about who we already are. When we succeed in moving outside our normal processes of self-reference and can look at ourselves with self-awareness, then we have a chance at changing. We notice something new." When you think about self-seal and how often we do it, but we don't know that we do it until we have a word for it, and I'm hoping that by sharing that, you can think about times when you see yourself closing off information. Let's look at two quick examples that were in the news last month. The former managing director of Credit Suisse was sentenced to 30 months in prison for fraud in the mortgage crisis. And his lawyer said in his defense, well, he'd never handled failure before. And that reminds us about our values. What we know about our values is if they're strongly held, they give us resilience in times of crisis. But if they're not strongly held, they don't do us much good. He said that he did what he did to preserve his reputation in the bank because there was great financial turmoil in the market, as if his reputation to the bank was so important that he did it for the bank, when in fact what he did was causing, in part, that turmoil around us. So it was an interesting kind of rationalization. The person you may know more about, because he's been in the news for the last 10 years, Dennis Kozlowski, the former CEO of Tyco International, who gave a $2 million birthday party for his wife and billed half of it to the company because there were some people invited there, and they had a meeting, and it was fine to do, he said. He also took $150 million of money and put it into his bonus, which was unauthorized. He got out of jail, serving time 7 years, and was out on parole. And he said, I fell into what I can best describe as a CEO bubble. That's an interesting rationalization for doing what you do, a CEO bubble. And I rationalized I was more valuable than I was. I was wrong. Which leads to this sort of self-seal that says, gosh, if you were as valuable as you thought you were, would that have still justified taking the $150 million for an unauthorized bonus? Probably not. We break the self-seal when we see that we're in self-seal when we start to close down and we shut out information. But when we become aware of what triggers us and can stop going into self-seal, then we have a chance to understand how to be accessing again our deeper ways of knowing, our values, and the other things about us. When our values are internalized and when our thinking goes beyond I to we, obviously both those gentlemen defined themselves by their roles. They were their jobs, which makes it extremely difficult then for them to operate and move differently. And they weren't really thinking about anything except what worked for them, which tends not to make for a positive situation for leaders. I'd like you to take just a couple of minutes, not all 5, but I'd like you to turn to the person maybe that you didn't turn to last time, or the same partner, and just look at what ways mindfulness might support you in reducing triggers that might lead to self-seal, how mindfulness, whether it's meditation, yoga, walking, pausing, breathing, how it might help you be more present, because when we're really present, it's a very powerful way to make decisions. And how it might help you feel more equilibrium, more in the zone. So if you would take maybe 2 minutes to just share with each other some quick thoughts, that would be terrific. And if you can come up with what you might be willing to do something that might support you in mindfulness, that would be great too. So thank you. I'll let you know when 2 minutes are up. We're at our third idea, and it's where everything comes together, and it's proof of why. Spiritual intelligence does fuel leadership. I want to give you some wonderful examples of how values take hold in a culture when there's a wholehearted process to create we. The most important thing, I think, about leadership is conveying on the deepest level why you do what you do to employees and to stakeholders and to others, because it has the capacity to just inspire and excite people. And what we know about research is that purpose can motivate people as powerfully as profit. There's a great restaurateur in New York City. His name is Danny Meyer, and he has a purpose called Enlightened Hospitality. He's got now, it could be 12.5 or more individual restaurants that have separate, not chains, but separate restaurants in different parts of the country. And when he opened his second restaurant, he'd always been conscious of values, but when he opened his second restaurant, he thought he wanted leaders everywhere in his organization, no matter what they did. And so he began to systematize the values process they had about how to get enlightened hospitality, and he came up with a performance review. 49% of every employee's performance review was based on technical competence of whatever it was they were doing. 51% was based on emotional experience, their impact on the people that they worked with, coworkers, customers. The 51% determined how successful they were in the company. He asked that for each day for 10 minutes, every single employee at every level think about 3 things that they could do to especially delight a customer. So you add up the aggregate of all those people, all those hours, all those days, and you get an enormous, enormous impact. When that second restaurant opened, which is called Gramercy Tavern, when the New York Times did their review, the reviewer said, "I felt an energy when I walked across the threshold." Values become energy when there is this wonderful way of enlivening them. One quick story, there was a husband and a wife celebrating their anniversary at one of their restaurants, and the waiter overheard the husband and the wife upset because the husband had left the champagne in the freezer while they went to dinner, and they figured it would explode while they were eating at the restaurant, and they were upset because this was the special anniversary. The waiter said, "Sir, I'd be very happy to send someone if you let the doorman know. Be very happy to send someone and take the champagne out." And the husband was upset enough that he said, "Okay." And so they sent someone, and when the couple came, and you can imagine they then began to enjoy their dinner. When the couple came back home to their apartment and opened up the refrigerator, there was the champagne, but there was also a small box of chocolate-covered strawberries with a handwritten note saying, "Dear Mr. and Mrs., thank you so much for taking the time to spend a very special evening in your life with us. We really appreciate it." Enlightened hospitality. I'm looking at 3 quick companies that I want to contrast. Now, in Mitsubishi, when we did the whole values process and let all employees pick values, our wholeheartedness was a really systematic, making sure we thought through of everything we could. It took 2 years before the values impacted every single level of the company down to the group level. So that's a wholeheartedness that doesn't have to be hugs and excitement. The other 2 companies are wholeheartedness where there is an emotional reaction from the part of the CEOs about loving employees and about a spirit in which at the Container Store they have 7 foundational principles but 10 characteristics of what makes a great employee. And there's a year-long performance review where every single employee is expected to evaluate himself or herself against those 10 characteristics. So the performance review is huge. Their manager is also expected to be reviewing them and evaluating them based on every characteristic. And so at the end of the year, there's a 2 to 3 hour meeting with every employee to celebrate. There are no surprises, they get feedback along the way, to celebrate what's been accomplished. It creates a tremendous amount of excitement about being seen and heard, about people caring about your development, about growing in your work, and about connecting to the larger purpose. The Container Store sells boxes, but that's not their purpose. And I think what's fundamental is they, like Zappos, are in a constant feedback loop. They're getting information from all sources because they deliberately seek it, because they constantly want improvement in what they're doing. They have an annual We Love Employee Days, which they celebrate with cupcakes and balloons, but it's the idea that every single store knows how important they are. In Zappos, they have 10 core values. They use it, as does the Container Store, in decision making. And in Zappos and the Container Store, nobody has to ask a manager how to handle a problem because everybody's empowered to know how to do it because everybody is living the values or they don't belong there. In Zappos, the CEO sends out an email to every single employee, vendor, and partner saying, "Can you give me 3 to 4 sentences about what the values did for you this year? Were there any experience you want to share? They put together, they publish everything. I got the 2011, it's 350 pages of all employees choosing to share the most meaningful things and funny things and weird things, but they connect on a level of purpose. They also are totally focused on serving customers, as is the Container Store. But it's done in such a way that, well, in the words of the CEO of the Container Store, he says he thinks it's the moral obligation of a CEO to make an employee want to get up in the morning and come to work. And so they create a dynamic where that happens. A very quick story, my stepdaughter was going to college 3 years ago as a freshman, and the Container Store closed their regular hours and then opened again at night for incoming freshmen and their parents to shop. And there was a couple of hundred families lined up at 8:30 at night. And the employees came down with signs that allowed you, if you were a student, to put a mark where you were going to school. And so everybody had this sense of wholeness, that they were all part of something, and it was really very special. And then when they got to go into the store, employees were lined up on either side, applauding wildly and saying things to each student like, "Oh, this is great, we're so happy you're here. You must be so excited. You must feel so proud of what you've accomplished." I was watching the faces. There were tears glistening in some eyes of kids, and parents were just radiant. I was fighting tears. There's something so amazing about a company that knows how to acknowledge people, that sense of humanity. Nobody bought any more that night, I'm sure, than they were going to buy. It was about the experience of feeling completely connected to the people that were selling to you. It's part of a wholeness of the authenticity of how these particular companies, and there are so many more, and hopefully several of your companies, that are taking the idea of how they allow themselves to connect to people on a deeper level. I think what's really important about the ways in which wholehearted values show up is that it's not just top down, it's not just bottom up, it's middle across. The values are owned because of the belief in the bigger difference that they think that people are making, because of the common language, because of how people view leadership, that leadership, everyone owns a piece of it, that they have responsibilities in how they do their jobs. You don't have to be the CEO. And there's a sense of connection that allows you to see that the definition of spiritual intelligence that I've asked you to think about, and I hope that you will, brings out the very best that we have to offer. And when we don't have the information we need, the concept of the feedback loops of constantly asking and giving each other support and information and letting us know how we're doing is really fundamental to everybody's success. And spiritual intelligence is really nothing more than showing up in the very most basic way we can, connected to other people, knowing that we're working towards something where everybody has a piece of information that could make all the difference in the world to our success. Thank you very much.